The first cruelty of the season was meant to be quiet, a courtesy folded around a blade, but Iris Ashcombe heard every word of it through the panel of a door that had not been shut with enough care to keep her out. She did not turn. She did not lower her head. She did not give the two women in the drawing room the satisfaction of a startled step in the corridor behind them. The house went on as it had been going on for 120 years, indifferent to the small rearrangement of a life inside its plaster. And Ashcombe Hall in the county of Wiltshire in the spring of 1815 leaned its long shoulders into the evening as if it were a gentleman half asleep in a chair, unwilling to be disturbed by anything so slight as the pain of a girl who did not, by the reckoning of the room she stood outside, quite exist. Beyond the tall windows, the park settled in that gray-gold hush that comes just after the rooks have finished their arguing, and just before the candles are called for, and the light chose, as light in that house always chose, to gild the portraits of the dead, and to leave the living in shadow. In the drawing room, her aunt and her elder sister were bent over a flat leather case laid on the little writing table, and the case held a miniature painted on ivory of Cordelia Ashcombe, aged 22, cream-shouldered, pearl-throated, eyes lifted 1/4 of an inch toward heaven in the manner recommended by every drawing master north of Bath. It was a very pretty picture. It had been paid for out of household money that might otherwise have gone toward mending the roof above the west stair, and no one in the family had mentioned this, because in the arithmetic by which the Ashcombes now lived, a portrait of Cordelia was an investment, and a bucket beneath the west stair was not. The miniature was to be sent that week to the Duke of Winford at Ravenholt, in answer to an inquiry he had made through his aunt as to whether any of the neighboring gentry had daughters of suitable age and disposition, an inquiry that had gone through 5 drawing rooms before it reached theirs, and had lost, along the way, any of the words that might have suggested he was inquiring after 2. Behind the door, Iris stood with a work-basket in her arms and did not move, because to move would have been to acknowledge that she had heard, and the small courtesy of pretending she had not heard was the last piece of household property she still owned outright. It was her Aunt Millicent who spoke first, in the light, decorative voice she reserved for the delivery of verdicts. The likeness, said her aunt, was very fine. Though the painter had perhaps flattered the mouth a little, still, one did not begrudge a mouth its flattery when so much depended on it. Cordelia laughed the laugh she had been perfecting since she was 15, a small silvery sound trained upon audiences of 1, and said that the mouth was quite her own. Thank you. Then her aunt's voice softened into the particular tenderness she used for cruelty, and she said what she had been meaning to say all afternoon. It was a mercy, she said, that the Duke had asked after a daughter and not after daughters, for there was really only the one to send. Cordelia was the picture of the house, its natural ornament. Iris was, she paused, considering, choosing. Iris was useful. She was useful about the linen, and useful about the accounts, and useful in a sick room, and one did not put usefulness into an ivory frame and post it to a duke. It was not a question. It was a report of the weather. In the corridor, Iris did not, at first, feel anything a listener could have named. She felt instead a small, clean click behind her breastbone, as of a lock turning in a door that had been standing open all her life, and after the click a great quiet in which she could hear, very distinctly, the tick of the long clock at the end of the passage, and the drawing of her own breath and the tiny domestic ruination of a moth against the glass of the corridor lamp. Useful. She turned the word over in the palm of her mind, as one turns a pebble that has been polished by a stream and found, on turning it, that it had been polished into that shape by a great deal of water passing over it for a long time. Useful. It was the coat that the word unwanted had chosen to wear that year. She stood a moment longer, then walked on toward the linen press as if she had never paused, because there was mending to do, and because the house did not stop for the arithmetic of its own indignities, and because her mother, before she died, had told her that a woman's dignity is a small candle you carry across a windy yard, and that no one else is obliged to shield the flame. It was one of the things her mother had said in the last winter of her life, sitting up in the great bed with her hands laid on the coverlet like two folded letters, her voice thinned but not lessened by illness. She had said other things that winter, but Iris kept that one nearest, because it was homely enough to be repeated in an ordinary voice on an ordinary morning, and true enough to be repeated at 3 a.m, when nothing else served. A woman's dignity is a small candle you carry across a windy yard, and no one else is obliged to shield the flame. She had said it about a servant's dismissal, and about a rector's wife, and once about a queen she had said it, at the very end, about Iris herself, laying a hand not quite steady on Iris's wrist, and looking at her with the level gaze of a woman who had decided in advance to spend her last strength on a plain sentence. Iris was 17 then. She was 22 now, and she had carried the candle through a good many yards, and the flame had not gone out, though there had been evenings when it had bent so low along the wick that she had watched it and wondered. She reached the linen press and set down the basket and put her hand, without meaning to the small object she wore always on a plain ribbon under the muslin of her gown. It was a thimble. It was not a fashionable thimble. It was worn silver, dulled from a lifetime of small use, and around its narrow rim her mother's initials had been chased once, and half rubbed away by the pad of a thumb that had needed to press very hard for a great many years. Cordelia, on the day the drawer had been divided, had picked up the thimble between 2 fingers and let it fall back among the buttons and said, laughing kindly, that Iris might have it, since Iris was the one who sewed. That, too, was a report of the weather. Iris had taken the thimble as if she had been given the crown jewels, which in her private ledger she had been, and she had strung it on a ribbon that night and worn it ever since beneath her clothes, where its small, cool weight rested against her breastbone, in the place where the click had lately occurred. She stood now with her hand pressed lightly over it through the muslin, and felt it warm at once to the skin, as it always did, and thought, in a voice that was almost her mother's, that a thimble was in its way a very fine ornament, since it existed to protect a finger that intended to keep on working. She lifted her hand away, because sentiment beyond a certain measure was a form of self-indulgence her mother had not permitted, and she opened the press and began to sort the sheets that were fit from the sheets that were only nearly fit. And by the time her aunt swept along the corridor to summon her to write out the direction on the little parcel that was to go to Ravenholt, the mending had been counted, the accounts of the still room revised in her head, and no one in the house, except a moth against a lamp, had witnessed anything at all. The parcel was addressed in Iris's hand, because Iris's hand was the best in the house, a fact acknowledged by the household in the manner in which useful facts about her were acknowledged, that is, silently and only when a use was required of them. She wrote the Duke's title and his seat with the tidy discipline of a woman who had learned early that a curved line drawn without hesitation is a form of self-respect, and she did not permit her wrist to shake, and she did not permit herself to look at the small leather case that lay beside the inkstand, waiting to be wrapped. Her aunt watched her write with the expression of a woman appraising a serviceable horse. Cordelia, who had come in with her shawl trailing, sat at the pianoforte and struck 3 notes and abandoned them, and said, without turning, that Iris's hand really was too good to waste on inventories. It was, she added, a hand that could have been trained for anything. In another sort of life. The words sounded affectionate. The pressure underneath them was not. Iris finished the direction, blotted it, laid down the pen, and said, in the mild, courteous voice she had spent 5 years perfecting, that she was very glad her hand was of use, since a hand that was of no use to anyone would surely have been an affliction. Her aunt smiled the small, approving smile she reserved for behavior that confirmed her theories, and Cordelia laughed the silvery laugh, and neither of them heard the second sentence Iris did not speak, which was a whole small speech about hands, and the training of hands, and the price of training, and which she folded neatly inside herself as she had folded a great many speeches over the years, because a woman who spent her retorts as soon as they arrived was left with nothing to carry across the windy yard when the wind rose. She wrapped the case in soft paper, she tied it with tape, she sealed it with a wafer, and she carried it herself to the hall table, where the manservant would take it in the morning, and as she set it down among the other letters going out, she looked at it a moment, as one looks at a small boat one has helped to launch, without ill will, without hope, only with the level appraisal of a person who has done a piece of work she was asked to do, and now returns to the work she was not asked to do. Behind her the drawing-room resumed the business of an ordinary evening. Cordelia found the 3 notes she had abandoned and made them into a phrase, and her aunt commented on the phrase, and the fire moved once in the grate, and the moth against the corridor lamp gave up at last and lay down on the sill, and the house forgot, as houses forget, that anything had happened in it at all. It was not the evening of a betrothal. It was not the evening of a proposal. It was, however, the evening on which Iris Ashcombe first understood, quite clearly and without heat, that she had been assigned a word by the people who owned her days, and that she would have to decide, in the years remaining to her, what to do with the word once she had it. Useful, she said at once in her mind, on the stair, as she went up to bed with her single candle held low, and it fell into the quiet of her breathing like a coin dropped into a well, and made a small ring, and then was still. By the following morning the parcel was gone from the hall table, and the house had rearranged itself around its absence, with the tidiness of a household long practiced in pretending nothing had ever been anywhere it was no longer. It was one of the small competences of Ashcombe Hall that nothing important seemed ever to have been shifted from its place, though a good deal had gone. The silver had gone, most of it, in the 3rd year of Iris's father's illness. The good carriage had gone in the 4th. A set of hunting prints and 2 Dutch landscapes had gone, more discreetly, in the seasons that followed his death, and in every case the removed thing had been replaced, on the same wall or the same sideboard, by an ornament so nearly of a size that a guest could not have said with certainty what had once stood there. That was Iris's doing. She had rearranged the drawing-room 3 times in 5 years, and each time made it look as if it had never been rearranged at all. That, too, was familiar. No one saw. The morning was a bright, mannered spring morning, and by 9 her aunt had received a letter from her particular friend Mrs. Halberd in the next parish, and by 10 Mrs. Halberd's letter had produced the intelligence that the Duke of Winford himself, having concluded certain business in the county, was expected at Halberd Priory within the week, and that Mrs. Halberd, in the natural fullness of her heart, had proposed to give a small evening for him, small being the word the county used for any gathering under 70. By 11 Cordelia had chosen her gown. By noon it had been decided, without anyone quite deciding it, that Iris should come too, because Cordelia would need someone to carry her fan and her shawl, and to be relied upon to say the right thing to Mrs. Halberd's deaf aunt about the fernery, and because, as her aunt observed with the airy realism she prized in herself, an unmarried elder sister, without an unmarried younger sister behind her, looked, in a drawing-room, a little exposed. It was not phrased as a compliment. It was not phrased as anything at all. It was a piece of household weather. Iris received it as she received all such weather, with a small inclination of the head and an offer to see that Cordelia's white gown was let out at the sleeve where the seam had gone, and she went upstairs to do the letting out. And it was there, sitting by the window with the white muslin across her knees and the small silver thimble on her finger, that she permitted herself, for the length of one breath, to imagine what it would be to walk into a room and be seen. The picture came very clearly, as such pictures did, and then, as such pictures did, went. She threaded the needle. She set the first stitch. She kept the candle burning across the yard. Halberd Priory sat in a fold of the Downs 3 miles from Ashcombe, older than any of the families who used it and better preserved than most of them, with a long, low front of soft gray stone that took the evening light in the way old stones do, as if agreeing to it rather than reflecting it. On the night of Mrs. Halberd's small evening, the drive was crowded, with carriages by 7:30, and the hall smelt of lilies and beeswax, and the particular clean cold of a house that had been aired all day in preparation for being closed all night. And beneath the lilies, if one had a nose for such things, there was a fainter, sharper scent of fresh green from the boughs in the great vases, and beneath that again, the polite, steady scent of anxiety. Iris caught all 4 scents as she came in, gave up her cloak to a footman she had known since he had been a boy in the Ashcombe stables, and stepped after her aunt and her sister into the long saloon. She wore the gray silk that had been her mother's, made over twice, and no ornament at her throat, and no ornament in her hair, which had been dressed by her own hand as it always was, plainly and well. The thimble lay under the silk in its usual place. She was, she knew, invisible to at least 2/3 of the room within the first minute, and she preferred it that way, because invisibility was, in its fashion, a form of freedom. Cordelia, beside her, was not invisible. Cordelia had chosen the white with the pale blue sash and the small pearls at her ears, and Cordelia had practiced her smile in 3 mirrors before leaving Ashcombe, and Cordelia moved through the doorway with the particular soft confidence of a young woman who had been told, correctly, that she was the prettiest thing likely to enter that room that season. Their aunt smiled the small proprietary smile of a gardener who has brought her best bloom to a show. And Mrs. Halberd, coming forward with both hands out, kissed Cordelia and pressed her hand, and greeted their aunt with the warmth of a woman confirmed in her own generosity, and said to Iris only, kindly, that she was so glad Iris had felt equal to coming, since she knew how much Iris was needed at home. Iris said she was very glad to be there. Mrs. Halberd's kindness was, she knew, entirely sincere, which made it the harder to bear. Because a barb aimed at one's usefulness cannot be reproached when it has been thrown with an open hand. She stepped aside and let Cordelia be conducted forward. She was already, at that moment, the sister who was not in the picture. She had been that sister long enough to know how to stand in a well-lit room without occupying any of the light, and she took her place near a tall window that gave onto the terrace and settled her hands into the pose that had served her since she was 17, one loose in the other, at rest, ready to be summoned and not obtrusive if left. From that station she could see most of the saloon and be seen by very few of it, which was, she had long ago decided, the best possible arrangement. The Duke of Winford was not yet in the room. His absence was itself an event. The whole saloon was arranged, subtly, around the door by which he would come in, and the guests, without seeming to, had oriented their bodies as flowers orient themselves toward a sun that has not yet risen. Iris watched the orientation with a small, dry amusement she did not permit her face to show. She had never seen the Duke. She had heard him described, in the particular language that county drawing rooms reserve for men of his rank and repute, as tall, dark, exacting, cold in his manners, quick in his speech, unreadable in his temper, and possessed of an estate large enough that any of these qualities might be recast, in the imagination of a mother of daughters, as virtues. She had heard him described, more privately, by her cousin Reginald, who had been briefly in the same regiment as one of his cousins, as a man who did not laugh often, and, when he did, laughed only at the truth, which Reginald had offered as a warning, and which Iris had received as the first genuinely interesting thing anyone had said about him. She thought of that now, watching Cordelia arranged in a chair near the pianoforte with her white sleeves showing to advantage against the polished wood, and thought that a man who laughed only at the truth would find in this room a great many things not to laugh at. It was at that moment, precisely as the small clock on the mantel chimed the 3/4, that the great door at the far end of the saloon opened, and the room performed, all at once, the little involuntary act it had been rehearsing for an hour. The talk did not stop. It thinned. Postures straightened by 1/4 of an inch along 100 spines. A laugh at the far corner was cut off mid-word, and its owner, embarrassed, coughed and smoothed her glove. The candles, which had done nothing at all, seemed for a fraction of a second to burn more attentively. Iris felt the ripple pass through the room, as one feels the small change in air before rain, and she looked, as everyone looked, toward the door and saw, framed there for the length of a breath, a man taller than the frame required him to be, in plain evening black, with a face composed into that particular careful blankness that people of high rank use in place of an expression when they do not yet know what expression the room deserves. His hair was very dark. His eyes she could not yet see. He inclined his head slightly to Mrs. Halberd, who had hurried forward, and he did not smile. And he came into the saloon as one who has been in a great many saloons, and has learned to enter them without appearing to require any of them to notice. The room, of course, noticed. It could hardly do otherwise. Mrs. Halberd began her introductions with the delicacy of a woman conducting a small orchestra, and the Duke passed along the near end of the saloon in her wake with the unforced attention of a man who had been taught before he could read to remember the names of strangers, and Iris, from her station at the window, watched him without seeming to, and thought, with a coolness that surprised her, that a man could be handsome and it need mean nothing, and that a man could be feared and it need mean nothing, and that what mattered in a room like this was what a man's silence did when it was not being spoken over. His silence did a great deal. It made a small circle around him wherever he stopped, and the circle was neither hostile nor warm. It was, simply, empty of credence, and the people who stepped into it and stepped out again seemed subtly relieved to have been briefly required to say only what they meant. Iris noted this. She did not know why she noted it. She threaded, in her mind, a needle, and set a stitch, and kept still. He came to Cordelia in the ordinary progress of the introductions, and bowed over her hand with a courtesy so exact that no one could afterward have complained of it. He said, in the low, dry voice that came, Iris found, as no surprise at all, that he was very glad to make Miss Ashcombe's acquaintance, and that he had indeed seen a likeness of her which had been kindly forwarded to him, and which had, he must say, prepared him imperfectly for the original. It was a compliment made in the exact shape of a compliment, and it was received by Cordelia as such, with a small blush that had cost her a great deal of practice, and a downward flick of the eyes that had cost her more. Their aunt, standing near, permitted herself the smallest breath of pleasure. Mrs. Halberd beamed. The Duke's face did not change. He said one or two other things, all of them correct, and he asked after her journey, which had been short, and he inquired after her father, who was dead, an error Cordelia corrected with a soft downward inflection Iris had watched her rehearse in the carriage. The Duke apologized without warmth and without any suggestion that he required to be forgiven, and Cordelia laughed her silvery laugh, and the exchange came to its natural end, and it was at that moment, precisely at the moment in which he might have moved on to the next introduction, that his eyes lifted from Cordelia's face and traveled, unhurried, over the small semicircle of watchers around her, and stopped, without appearing to have chosen to stop, on the gray figure at the window. His gaze was not long. It was not admiring. It was not, so far as Iris could read it in that instant, anything at all. It was only present, in the sense in which a scale is present under a weight. It registered her, and it registered whatever it was that stood inside her, and it moved on. But it had stopped. And Iris, who had spent 5 years being not seen in rooms of every size and temper, felt against the skin of her breastbone a sudden small warmth where the silver thimble lay, and thought, with a coolness that alarmed her more than any heat would have done, that she had been counted. She did not move. She did not lower her head. She did not give the room the satisfaction of a startled step. She only, after the Duke had turned back to Mrs. Halberd and been drawn away toward the next chair, allowed herself a single breath drawn slowly through the nose and released as slowly through the lips, and thought, in her mother's voice, that a candle carried carefully across a windy yard is not the less a light for being briefly regarded by a stranger who does not know its name. Supper at the Priory was laid in the long dining room, and the guests were disposed at Mrs. Halberd's table, according to a plan she had drawn out 3 times on the back of a laundry list, and Iris, by that plan, was set well down the table between the deaf aunt of the fernery and a young clergyman whose curacy depended on saying the right thing to whoever spoke to him. Cordelia was set, by that same plan, 3 places from the Duke, on the same side, which was the arrangement Mrs. Halberd had decided, after long thought, would give the ladies the best chance without appearing to give it. The Duke sat between Mrs. Halberd on his right and Lady Sarrow on his left, and Lady Sarrow, being the only woman of the Duke's own rank present, had come down determined to earn the seat. She was a widow of 40, small, bright, celebrated for her wit, and for a laugh which she had learned to place with such precision that it fell like a well-aimed pebble in exactly the pool for which it was intended. She wore a deep red silk, which no one in the room could have afforded but her, and her jewels caught the light with a hard glitter, and she opened her attack, if such it may be called, before the second course. She had a great respect, she said, for the country families who had held their ground through such a difficult decade. It was quite remarkable, was it not, how much elegance one could still find in houses which had been obliged to practice the smaller economies. She spoke, of course, in general. Her eyes traveled, quite politely, over the whole table as she spoke, and rested nowhere. Her eyes rested nowhere, and everyone at the table understood at once where they had not rested. Mrs. Halberd laughed uncertainly. The Duke did not laugh. He inclined his head a quarter of an inch. In that way he had of appearing to have heard a remark without in the least having endorsed it, and he asked Lady Sarrow, mildly, whether she had had the pleasure of hearing Miss Ashcombe sing, since he had been told that she sang very well. Lady Sarrow permitted herself a small bright smile of concession. She had not, she said, had that pleasure, but she was sure it was a pleasure in store. Cordelia lowered her eyes with the correct blush. The talk moved on. It moved on very smoothly, because Mrs. Halberd was skilled with her table, and because the Duke was, when he chose, a superb steadier of conversation, and the small remark about the smaller economies became, as such remarks were meant to become, a piece of ambient weather, remembered a little uneasily by some, absorbed into the general climate by most. Iris ate what was placed before her and said the correct thing to the deaf aunt about the fernery, and encouraged the young clergyman when he ventured, hesitantly, an opinion about the new hymnal, and she did not once look toward the head of the table, because to look would have been to concede that she had been struck. And she had been struck, and she preferred that no one at the table, including herself, be permitted to consider the fact. It was later, in the drawing room after the ladies had withdrawn, that the second cruelty of the evening was delivered, and it was delivered, as such cruelties often are, in a voice of tender concern. Lady Sarrow had settled herself on the sofa nearest the fire, and had drawn about her a small circle of the younger women, of whom Cordelia, by natural gravitation, was one, and she was speaking, in her light considering way, of the difficulty of matches in an age of general retrenchment. There were, she said, so many worthy young women in the county whose portions had been reduced by circumstances quite beyond their control, and it was a subject that touched her, as she was sure it touched them all. It was in this connection, she said, that she had heard, and she paused and set her glass down, and glanced with a small apologetic smile toward the door, as if she wished to be sure that no servant was near, that the Ashcombes had lately been obliged to make certain arrangements about a portrait, and she did hope, she really did hope, that the arrangements had been effected without embarrassment, since these things had a way of being talked of. There have been stories, she said. Is everything quite all right? She said it to Cordelia, but her eyes flicked once, quickly, across the room to where Iris stood at the sideboard pouring out coffee for Mrs. Halbert's mother, and her eyes returned. Cordelia's color rose. Cordelia's mouth opened and stayed a moment open, and Cordelia, whose weapons had been drilled for the pianoforte and not for the sofa, produced a laugh that was not quite silvery, and said that she was sure she did not know what Lady Sarrow could mean. Lady Sarrow laid a small light hand on Cordelia's wrist and said, of course, she would not have mentioned it for the world, only she did feel it was better a friend should say than a stranger. It was not a question. It was a knife slipped between two ribs and rotated a quarter of a turn. In the small silence that followed, Iris set the coffee pot down and crossed the room without appearing to hurry, and put the cup into Mrs. Halbert's mother's hand, and said, in a voice pitched to reach exactly the circle at the sofa and no farther, that she was so glad Lady Sarrow had raised the subject, since her sister was too modest to speak of it, but the portrait of Cordelia had been sent last week to the Duke's aunt at Ravenholt with her family's compliments, and had been most kindly received, and she was sure any story to the contrary had arisen only from the general kindness of the county in taking an interest in the Ashcombes' affairs. She said it lightly, without emphasis, without looking at Lady Sarrow, without any suggestion that she had heard anything untoward, as though she were merely completing, out of a sister's love, a sentence Cordelia had begun. Cordelia's color went down. Lady Sarrow's small, light hand withdrew itself from Cordelia's wrist. Lady Sarrow smiled the smile of a fencer, whose foil has been turned aside without any acknowledgement that a foil had been extended, and said, oh, but of course, she was delighted to hear it. She had known it must be so. And then, because she was Lady Sarrow, she added, considering the coffee cups on the tray, that Miss Iris was so very quick, was she not, so very quick to say the useful thing. The word landed on the tray between them like a small coin. Useful. Iris inclined her head with the polite smile of a woman receiving a compliment, and said only that she was glad then to have been of use. It sounded like agreement. It was not. Behind her, unheard by anyone in the room, Cordelia's silvery laugh returned, and the deaf aunt at the fernery, catching the tail of a phrase, said, delighted, that the ferns had done particularly well that year, and Mrs. Halberd, sensing rescue, seized upon the ferns and led the conversation into them, and Iris withdrew, as she had come, into the small clean space just behind other people's attention, where she preferred to keep house. She did not know, as she withdrew, that the Duke of Winford, standing at that moment in the doorway between the dining room and the drawing room, with a glass in his hand and his aunt's letter of introduction still in his pocket, had heard every word of the exchange, from Lady Sarah's first light apology to the tidy small sentence about being glad to be of use. And that he had heard it because he had, quite deliberately, waited a moment longer in the doorway than the gentleman behind him had expected, and that he had heard it in the particular silence he used for hearing things which the rest of the room believed were being spoken only among themselves. He did not enter. He did not, when at last he did enter, look toward Iris. He crossed the room in his usual unhurried way, took his place near his hostess, complimented her on the coffee, and did not, in the whole rest of the evening, address a single further word to Cordelia Ashcombe, or to Iris Ashcombe, or to Lady Sarah. That was the second cruelty of the evening. And it was, by the reckoning of the room, so quietly done that no one who had not been counting could have said with certainty that anything had happened at all. By the following evening, the miniature that had gone to Ravenholt had been sent back. It arrived not by the common post, but by a private servant in the Winford livery, who presented himself at the door of Ashcombe Hall with the little parcel and a folded note, and delivered both into the hand of the manservant with the polite firmness of a man carrying out instructions he had been given very exactly. The note, when it was opened in the drawing-room a quarter of an hour later by Iris's aunt with fingers that had begun, for the first time in years, to tremble, was very short. The Duke of Winford, it said, presented his compliments to Mrs. Ashcombe and to her nieces, and begged to return the picture with his thanks, since he found upon reflection that the young lady whose likeness had been so obligingly forwarded was not the young lady of the Ashcombe family in whom he wished to inquire further. He would, if it were not disagreeable to the family, do himself the honor of calling at Ashcombe Hall in the course of the following week, at whatever hour Mrs. Ashcombe might find it convenient to receive him, in order to make the acquaintance of the other Miss Ashcombe, of whom he had heard, and to whom he did not wish to do the discourtesy of inquiring further at second hand. He remained, with every proper expression, hers, Winford. There was no other name in the letter. He had not needed to write it. In the drawing-room, the fire moved once in the grate, and the moth at the corridor lamp gave up, as it had given up, on any of 100 previous evenings, and Iris's aunt read the note through a second time, in a voice from which the ordinary decoration had been entirely stripped, and Cordelia, who had come in with her shawl trailing, stood in the middle of the carpet with her mouth in a shape it did not usually make. Iris was in the still room, counting jars. She heard her name called through 2 doors, in a tone she did not recognize, and she wiped her hands on her apron and untied the apron and hung it on its peg and went, unhurriedly, along the passage toward the drawing-room. And the small silver thimble on its ribbon beneath her muslin lay warm against her breastbone as she walked, as if a hand had briefly rested there and been withdrawn. She came into the drawing-room as she had come into it 1,000 times, and the room was not the same room, and the people in it were not the same people, though the wallpaper had not altered by a shade, and the fire moved in the grate exactly as it had moved half an hour before. Her aunt stood by the little writing table with the letter open in her hand, and her mouth set in a shape Iris had not seen on it before. A shape that had had, at some earlier moment of Millicent Ashcombe's life, a great deal of practice, and had since been set aside. Cordelia stood in the middle of the carpet, with the shawl slipped from one shoulder and one hand at her throat, as though she had been about to say something and had forgotten, halfway to speech, what the words were for. On the little writing table lay the small leather case, unwrapped, the miniature face up. Cordelia's painted eyes lifted a quarter of an inch toward heaven with the same patient obedience with which they had lifted the week before. No one, that evening, was looking at them. Her aunt spoke first, in a voice from which all the decoration had been rubbed away and only the working parts left visible. She said that the Duke had returned the picture. She said that the Duke had written that he wished to make the acquaintance of the other Miss Ashcombe. She said the last 3 words twice, as though pressing the shape of them with the pad of her thumb to be sure of the initials. Then she folded the letter along its original folds and laid it upon the table beside the case with the tidy gentleness people use for objects they suspect of being about to move on their own, and she looked, without any decoration at all, at Iris. Iris did not move. She did not turn. She did not lower her head. She stood in the doorway with her hands loose in front of her in the pose that had served her since she was 17, and she felt against the skin of her breastbone the small silver warmth of the thimble under the muslin, and she thought, in a voice that was not quite her mother's but had been shaped by her mother's, that a candle carried carefully across a windy yard is not obliged to explain itself to any wind that has failed to put it out. She said, in the mild, courteous voice she had spent 5 years perfecting, that the Duke was very kind to write, and that of course Mrs. Ashcombe would answer him as she saw fit. It was not a surrender, and it was not a claim. It was a hand held out flat, palm up, empty, in the way one holds a hand out to a horse whose disposition one has not yet had time to read. Her aunt looked at the hand and did not, for a long moment, know what to do with it. Cordelia, who had at last remembered what she was for, produced a small silvery laugh and said, "Oh, but of course there was some mistake. The Duke's aunt had been misled by county gossip. No one had ever asked after Iris. No one had ever thought of Iris. It was absurd." She said it warmly, as she said everything warmly. The pressure underneath was not warm. Their aunt did not immediately answer, and Iris understood, in the small silence, that the arithmetic of the house was being rewritten in her aunt's head at a rate that surprised even her aunt. When Millicent Ashcombe spoke again, it was without looking at either niece. She said only that she would answer the Duke in the morning, that of course he must be received, that of course the acquaintance must be made, and that in the meantime the household would go on as if nothing had occurred, since nothing, as yet, had. It was a report of the weather. It was the report of a weather she had not forecast. She left the room with the letter in her hand and did not take the miniature with her, and the miniature lay upon the writing table looking up at the ceiling with its painted eyes, and after a moment Cordelia crossed the carpet and picked it up and closed the case with a snap that was louder than any other sound in the room and carried it away. And Iris was left standing in the doorway with the fire moving once in the grate and the moth at the corridor lamp giving up as moths give up, and she permitted herself, for the length of one breath, to press her hand lightly against the ribbon at her throat, and then she went back along the passage to the still room to finish counting jars, because the jars did not stop for the arithmetic of anyone's rearrangement, and because that too was familiar. No one saw. By the following evening the county knew. It knew in the particular manner in which the county knew such things, which was that no one had said anything and everyone had said everything, and by noon 3 carriages had come up the Ashcombe Drive on errands of such transparent invention that even the manservant had permitted himself, upon closing the door behind the third, a small dry cough that Iris, passing through the hall with a basket of cut lilac, heard and did not remark upon. Mrs. Halberd came herself in the afternoon with a bunch of hothouse violets and the particular breathless warmth of a woman who has been given, unexpectedly, a second act in a play she had thought concluded. She sat in the drawing room a full 3/4 of an hour, and she said many kind things about Iris's coloring, which she had not previously found occasion to notice, and she said many kind things about Iris's needlework, which she had not previously found occasion to see, and she said, in the tone in which she reserved her most delicate observations, that of course there had never been the slightest doubt in her own mind that Iris was a young woman of remarkable qualities, only, as she said with a small confidential laugh, one had not always had the opportunity to say so. It was affectionate. It was not a question. It was a coat that the word overlooked had chosen to wear. Iris thanked her for the violets and set them in the small blue jug on the mantel and offered her more tea, and did not, at any point in the 3/4 of an hour, permit her face to answer the small silvery apology Mrs. Halberd was, in her fashion, trying to make. When Mrs. Halberd rose to go, she pressed Iris's hand with both of her own and said that dear Cordelia must not, of course, be discouraged, since a duke, after all, was only a man, and men were known to change their minds twice in a week. She said it, Iris noted, kindly. She meant it kindly. And yet, walking her guest to the carriage, Iris understood without any anger at all that the county had rearranged its arithmetic about her overnight, that she had ceased to be useful and had become, instead, interesting, and that the two words were spoken by the same voices for the same reasons, and that the second was the more dangerous of the two, because it invited attention without conferring any of the protections attention was popularly supposed to bring. Behind her, in the drawing room, Cordelia was practicing, at the pianoforte, a phrase she had been trying to master for 3 weeks, and getting it, for the first time, exactly right, and the small silvery precision of the phrase followed Iris down the steps to the drive, and it was very pretty, and it was not comfort. It was a report of the weather. The Duke came, as he had said he would come, on a Wednesday afternoon that had the low-pearled light of a spring day, considering, without commitment, the possibility of rain. He came in a plain traveling chaise with a single servant and no retinue, and he came on the hour appointed and not a minute earlier, and he was shown into the drawing-room by the manservant with the small extra care servants used for guests whose displeasure would rearrange the household. He bowed to Mrs. Ashcombe with a courtesy no one could afterward have complained of, and he bowed to Cordelia with the same, and he took the chair Mrs. Ashcombe indicated, which was neither the best chair nor a poor one, and he sat in it with the settled stillness that Iris had first noticed at the Priory. The stillness that made a small circle of quiet around him, whether he intended it or not. Iris was not in the room. Iris had been asked, by her aunt, in a voice from which the decoration had been carefully replaced, to bring the tea things when they were rung for, and to stay a moment to see that everything was as it should be, and to withdraw thereafter, and Iris had inclined her head and said that she would do so, because a piece of choreography imposed by an aunt was still, at that hour, a piece of choreography, and she was not yet ready to refuse the small parts that were still being written for her. She waited in the passage outside, with the tray on the little side table and her hands loose in front of her, and she heard, through the door which had not been shut with quite enough care to keep her out, the shape of the exchange within. It was not, she noted, a long exchange. The Duke asked after Mrs. Ashcombe's health and after the recent frosts. Mrs. Ashcombe, in a voice made brave by rehearsal, thanked him and asked after his journey. Cordelia said, at the appointed moment, that she hoped his Grace had recovered from the fatigue of the road. The Duke said that the road had not fatigued him. There was a small pause in which Mrs. Ashcombe, contrary to all her convictions, produced a small nervous laugh, and it was into that laugh that the Duke said, without emphasis, that he was very glad, before he left, to have the opportunity of thanking Miss Ashcombe herself for the small kindness her sister had done him at Halberd Priory. Iris, in the passage, heard Cordelia catch her breath. She heard her aunt say, brightly, that of course Iris would join them directly, and she heard the bell rung, and she picked up the tray as if she had been waiting a great deal less time than she had been waiting, and she went in. He rose when she came in. He rose in the manner of a man for whom rising was not a decision, but a habit inherited from a father who had not thought of daughters at all when he taught him. He bowed. She curtsied. She set the tray on the low table and moved to pour, because her aunt's fingers, she saw at a glance, were not that afternoon to be trusted with the pot. And she poured out 3 cups in the precise measures each drinker preferred, without asking, and she handed each cup with the small, correct inclination of the head, and the Duke, taking his, said in a voice so low it fell only across the small space between them, and did not travel to the other side of the room, that he was much obliged to her. His eyes met hers over the cup for perhaps the length of a heartbeat. They were, she saw for the first time, gray, not cold gray. The gray of a sky that has not yet decided what weather it means to be. She said, in the voice she had spent 5 years perfecting, that she was glad to be of use. It sounded like the sentence she had said on the tray at the Priory. It was not the same sentence. Only she and the Duke in that room understood that it was not, and neither of them permitted the understanding to reach the face. He inclined his head 1/4 of an inch. He sat. She withdrew to the small chair her aunt indicated with an economical motion of the hand, and she folded her hands in her lap, and the small silver thimble on its ribbon lay warm against her breastbone in the place where the click had, some evenings before, occurred. The visit was not long. The Duke did not, in the course of it, address any question directly to Iris that could have been construed as an inquiry. He addressed his questions to Mrs. Ashcombe, who answered them as best she could, and to Cordelia, whose answers were pretty and correct, and he listened to both with the exact attention he had given to a footman's announcement of his carriage at the Priory, and in the intervals of listening he permitted his eyes to rest, without appearing to rest, on the small gray figure in the small chair by the wall. She did not look at him. She looked at her hands. She looked at the little blue jug of Mrs. Halberd's violets on the mantel. She looked at the moth that had, in a private mercy of the household economy, been quietly disposed of by a housemaid that morning, and no longer occupied the sill. She looked, once, at the Duke, when he asked Mrs. Ashcombe whether her nieces rode, and Mrs. Ashcombe replied that Cordelia rode very prettily, and that Iris had, of course, given up the exercise some seasons ago in order to see to the household. The Duke received this information with the settled blankness he had used at the Priory for remarks whose author he did not intend to spare. He said, in the mild, dry voice of a man reporting a small fact, that it was a pity, since the country round Ravenholt was uncommonly well suited to a rider of some patience. He did not look at Iris as he said it. He said it to Mrs. Ashcombe. Mrs. Ashcombe agreed nervously that yes, of course, a rider of patience would find much to admire there. Cordelia said, in a voice she had not quite decided the pitch of, that she herself had always thought patience the first of virtues in a rider. The Duke said, without emphasis, that patience was the first of virtues in a great many things, and that it was, in his experience, rarer than it looked. There was a small silence in the room. It was the silence of a room in which 4 people had all at once heard a sentence more than one of them was intended to hear. The fire moved once in the grate. Iris did not lift her eyes. But under the muslin, at the thimble, she felt a second click behind the first, and understood, with a coolness that alarmed her again, that she was being spoken to across the width of a drawing room in a language the drawing room did not entirely command. She said nothing. She poured him a second cup when he was ready for it, and she rose when he rose, and she curtsied when he bowed, and she stood a moment at the window after his chaise had gone down the drive, and she watched the low-pearled sky make up its mind at last in favor of rain. Her aunt sat down heavily upon the sofa and said, to no one in particular, that they must all of course reflect very carefully on the visit before drawing any conclusions from it. Cordelia stood at the pianoforte with one hand on the polished wood and did not, for the length of a whole minute, produce a note. Iris turned from the window and asked, in her mildest voice, whether her aunt would take another cup, and her aunt said, yes, thank you, and then, after a moment, and Iris. She said the name as if she had never quite said it before. She said it, Iris understood, as though it had recently acquired weight. Iris poured the cup. She did not answer the tone. She did not need to. The rain, arriving upon the windows, spoke for her. He came again, in the weeks that followed, at intervals designed to appear casual and appearing, to a household counting them, anything but. He came on a Tuesday, on the invitation of Mrs. Halberd, whose small evenings had grown suddenly frequent. He came on a Friday to inspect a horse Reginald had spoken of. He came, on a Saturday, without any invention at all, upon a road that he had, he said, thought to try for the exercise of his own mare, and which happened, by the arrangement of the county's geography, to pass the west gates of Ashcombe. On each occasion he stayed exactly the interval propriety required, and no longer, and on each he addressed the greater part of his conversation to Mrs. Ashcombe or to Cordelia. And on each, in one small window opened by the accident of a passed cup, or a dropped glove, or the ordinary business of a hostess turning to speak to a servant, he said one sentence to Iris in a voice pitched to reach her, and no other person in the room. He said, once, that he had heard she managed the accounts of the still room herself, and that he had always thought a still room account the fairest test of a household's honesty. He said once that the gray silk suited her, and left the sentence there, ornamented by nothing. He said once, in a passageway where they met by chance, because the passageway was narrow and he had timed his exit imperfectly, that he had, in the course of his own life, learned to mistrust the word useful, since it was so often applied by people to persons they had no intention of paying. He did not smile as he said it. He did not wait for her to answer. He inclined his head, took his hat from the manservant, and went out into a rain that had begun again while she was in the still room, and that showed no sign of remembering how to stop. Iris returned to her jars. She did not, that afternoon, allow her hand to rest against the ribbon at her throat, because a woman who touched a talisman every time it warmed would soon wear the ribbon through, and because her mother had said, once in the last winter of her life, that pleasure, like grief, was best rationed. But the sentence stayed with her. Useful, he had used the word plainly. He had used it as a diagnosis of a disease he had seen practiced upon her at Halberd Priory, and possibly in her own drawing-room. She turned the word over again in her mind, and it was, for the first time in a long while, warm to the touch. The county, meanwhile, in the manner of counties, took sides. Mrs. Halberd took Iris's side and let it be known that she had always seen the quality of the younger Miss Ashcombe, the vicar's wife, who owed her cushions to Iris's needle and her rector's collar to Iris's laundering, took Iris's side with the discreet fervor of a woman who has been made suddenly aware that she should have taken it earlier. The Sarrow party, which was small but glittering, did not take a side. It took, instead, an interest. and the interest expressed itself in the invitation of Iris and Cordelia both, along with their aunt, to the small evenings at Sarrow House, where Lady Sarrow now made a point of remembering Iris's name upon her arrival and forgetting it, gracefully, halfway through the evening. She said once, in a circle that included Cordelia and Mrs. Halberd and 2 young officers, that it was so refreshing, was it not, to see a young woman step out of the shadow of her sister. One did not often have the pleasure of watching a promotion in a family, since these things were usually managed so quietly. She said it with delight, considering warmth she reserved for her best cruelties. Iris, standing near the fire with a cup of chocolate in her hand, inclined her head and said, mildly, that it was so kind of Lady Sarrow to describe the affections of a family as a promotion, since so many people were sadly inclined to describe them as an obligation, and she was sure Lady Sarrow's phrase would be much repeated. She said it without emphasis, without any suggestion that she had heard anything untoward, as though she were merely completing a sentence Lady Sarrow had begun. Lady Sarrow's small light smile faded by a degree. Mrs. Halberd, sensing rescue, said quickly that the chocolate at Sarrow House was famous, and the officers agreed. Lady Sarrow permitted herself a laugh which was not universal, but enough. She said, considering the fire, that Miss Iris was so very quick, was she not, so very quick to say the graceful thing? It was the word she had used before. She used it now with the deliberateness of a woman who had noticed that the word had been struck out of the ledger and wished to write it back in. Iris permitted herself the smallest inclination of the head and did not answer, because a woman who spent her retorts as soon as they arrived was left with nothing to carry across the windy yard when the wind rose. And the wind, that season, was rising. It rose first through the servants, as such winds do. There had been, in the 2nd week after the Duke's first call at Ashcombe, an inquiry made at the village post office by a young man in plain clothes, with a very particular way of asking his questions, who had wished to know, on behalf of an interest he did not name, whether the younger Miss Ashcombe had, at any time in the previous year, been the subject of any letters of an unusual kind. The postmistress, who had known Iris since Iris was a child in a pinafore, and who had received, more than once, small tidy notes from Iris on behalf of the parish poor, had answered the young man's questions with the flat, plain hostility of a woman who intends to be remembered as hostile, and the young man had gone away. He had not, however, gone far. He had been seen, the following morning, in conversation at the crossroads with a manservant Iris did not know by name, but recognized by his livery as belonging to Sarrow House. He had been seen, the afternoon of the same day, taking a light meal at the inn with a red-faced man who had been observed some weeks before at the door of the servants' entrance at Ashcombe, inquiring after work that no one had had to give him. The postmistress passed her observations to the vicar's wife. The vicar's wife passed them to Mrs. Halberd. Mrs. Halberd, at her own small evening on a Wednesday, drew Iris into the window bay under the pretext of admiring a new print, and told her, in a hurried undertone, all that she had heard, and looked at her with the wide, anxious eyes of a woman who had at last found a story she could not enjoy. Iris thanked her. She said that of course such inquiries were only to be expected, and that she would take no notice of them. Mrs. Halberd said, more anxiously, that she hoped Iris would take some notice of them. Iris said nothing further, because there was nothing further to say that Mrs. Halberd could carry safely home, and she looked, once, across the room to where the Duke was standing in conversation with an elderly cousin of Mrs. Halberd's who had been rehearsing his one anecdote for a fortnight, and she saw that the Duke was listening to the anecdote with an attention perfectly calibrated to convey respect without inviting a second one. His eyes moved once, briefly, to the window bay, and he saw Iris, and Mrs. Halberd, and the print, and the anxiety, and he did not go on looking. It was not indifference. It was, Iris understood, the polite fiction of indifference maintained by a man who had counted 3 carriages and a manservant himself, and did not intend the room to see him count. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, and it arrived not at Ashcombe, but at Ravenholt, and it did not, of course, come into Iris's hands until some days later, but its consequences were in the drawing room at Ashcombe by the middle of the following week, because the county had received the news of it before the Duke had finished reading it a second time. It was a letter of 1 page, written in a small, careful hand on plain paper of a kind used by 100 stationers, sealed with a wafer whose device had been so lightly pressed that it might have been any device or none, and addressed to the Duke of Winford at Ravenholt, with the punctilious formality that anonymous letters everywhere reserve for the men they mean to injure. It contained, in the language of a person unwilling to sign, 3 assertions. It asserted that Iris Ashcombe, the younger daughter of the late Sir Henry Ashcombe, had, in the autumn of the previous year, formed an attachment of an improper kind with a young officer stationed briefly near Ashcombe, whose name the writer regretted to be obliged to withhold in a letter that must reach a nobleman. It asserted that Iris Ashcombe had, in the course of that attachment, written letters of a kind that could not be defended, and that copies of those letters existed and were in the possession of persons who wished the Duke, as a gentleman, to be aware of them before proceeding further in an acquaintance which the county had begun to observe with concern. It asserted, finally, that it was the writer's duty, painful as the duty was, to bring these matters to his Grace's attention, since the alternative, that a man of his rank should be deceived into an alliance with a young woman of tarnished reputation, was one that no person of honor could contemplate in silence. The letter was signed "A Friend." It was, Iris said later to the only person who ever asked her, a very well-bred letter. It was also, from the first sentence to the last, false. There had been no officer. There had been no letters. There had been, in the autumn of the previous year, a young lieutenant of dragoons quartered for 6 weeks at the inn who had once, at a country dance, asked Iris to stand up with him for a set, and been refused with the mild courtesy she reserved for such requests when her aunt was watching, and there had been, so far as Iris was aware, no further transaction of any kind. But the letter did not require truth. The letter required only the possibility of truth, and county gossip, being an artist of some subtlety, could paint the possibility into a portrait within a fortnight, and a portrait once painted was very difficult to unmake. The Duke read the letter through twice. He folded it. He laid it upon the table by the window at Ravenholt. He rang and gave 2 quiet instructions to his steward. He wrote a short note in his own hand and directed it to Ashcombe Hall, and he sealed it with his own signet. And he stood a moment at the window looking out over the lake, and did not, for the length of a breath, permit his face any expression at all. Then he went out riding at a pace which the mare had not been asked to keep for some weeks, and did not return until the light was almost gone. That was Thursday. On Friday morning the letter, or the substance of it, was known to Lady Sarrow. On Friday afternoon it was known to Mrs. Halbert's cook. On Saturday it was known, in 3 separate versions each more damning than the last, to the whole parish. On Sunday, at church, the Ashcombes were greeted with the particular careful warmth country parishes reserved for families whose fortunes they have decided to reconsider, and Iris, walking out under her aunt's arm, understood that whatever had been done, and that the ground she stood upon was no longer the ground she had believed herself to be standing upon, and that a candle carried carefully across a windy yard would, in a wind of this order, require both hands. The Duke's note arrived at Ashcombe on Monday morning. It was very short. He begged Mrs. Ashcombe to receive him on Tuesday at 3, upon a matter of some seriousness, and he asked, with the utmost courtesy, that Miss Iris Ashcombe be present at the interview. It was not a question. Iris read the note over her aunt's shoulder and did not speak, and she went, before the household could rearrange itself around her, to the little writing desk in the still room, and she took a sheet of paper, and she wrote, in the tidy hand that had been counted a use, a letter of her own. She addressed it to her great-aunt, Lady Ashcombe of Wentmore, her father's sister, who was 83 and had not left her house in Somerset for 11 years and had, in the last winter of Iris's mother's life, sat 2 nights in a chair beside her mother's bed and spoken to her mother in a voice Iris had not been supposed to overhear and had never forgotten. She wrote the letter plainly. She said what had happened. She said what she believed to be true. She said what she believed to be false. She asked, without decoration, for whatever help her great-aunt might see fit to give. She sealed it, and she carried it herself to the manservant with a coin from her own small purse, and she instructed him, quietly, to see that it went by the fastest post and to say nothing of it in the house. He inclined his head as he had inclined his head to her father 20 years before, and he took the letter, and he took the coin, and he went. Then Iris returned to the still room, and she counted, once more, the jars, because the jars did not stop for the arithmetic of anyone's slander, and because she found, in the counting of jars, a small clean quiet in which the click behind her breastbone could be heard, and she had, that morning, several things she wished to hear it say. On Tuesday at 3, the Duke arrived in the plain traveling chaise, without any servant this time, and he was shown into the drawing-room, and Mrs. Ashcombe received him in a gown she had thought fit only for weddings and funerals, and Cordelia, by an arrangement made without discussion, was not in the room. Iris was. She sat in the small chair by the wall in the gray silk, and she had, at her throat, no ornament, and under the muslin, at her breastbone, the small silver thimble on its ribbon lay warm as if a hand had rested upon it. The Duke bowed. He sat in the chair Mrs. Ashcombe indicated. He accepted no tea, he said, in the low, dry voice he had used at the Priory and in the passageway and by the pianoforte, that he must beg Mrs. Ashcombe's indulgence to speak plainly, since the matter did not lend itself to circumlocution. Mrs. Ashcombe, who had spent the whole of Monday and the whole of Tuesday morning practicing the phrase, "I am sure my niece would never," said only that his Grace must speak as he thought fit. He inclined his head. He took from the inside of his coat a folded paper, which he laid upon the low table between them without opening. He said, without emphasis, that he had received on Thursday morning a letter which he did not propose to read aloud in a lady's drawing-room, but the substance of which was that Miss Iris Ashcombe had, in the autumn of last year, conducted a correspondence of a kind that would be much to her discredit, and that copies of certain letters written in that correspondence were in the possession of persons who wished him, in his own interest, to be made aware of them. He said this in the voice in which he had reported the weather at the Priory. He did not look at Iris as he said it. He looked at the folded paper on the table, and at Mrs. Ashcombe's hands, which had gone white at the knuckles. When he had finished, he lifted his eyes, and he looked then at Iris, and he said, quietly, that he wished to hear from Miss Ashcombe herself, in her aunt's presence, what she had to say. It was not a question. It was a hand held out flat, palm up, empty, in the way one holds a hand out to a horse whose disposition one has not yet had time to read. Iris looked at him across the small space. His eyes were the gray of a sky that had at last decided upon its weather. She said, in the voice she had spent 5 years perfecting, that she had never, in the autumn of last year or in any autumn, written a letter of the kind he described, and that she had never conducted a correspondence with any officer or with any gentleman. and that whoever had claimed the possession of such letters had claimed the possession of letters which did not exist. She said it plainly. She did not raise her voice. She did not, at any point in the sentence, permit her hands to move from where they rested in her lap. When she had finished, she said, further, that she thanked His Grace for having brought the matter to her aunt directly, since the alternative, that he should have judged her without hearing her, would have been an injustice she would have found harder to bear than the slander itself. The Duke did not answer for a moment. He looked at her with the settled attention he had first turned upon her at the Priory, and it seemed to Iris, for the length of a breath, that a small, unadmitted heat passed behind the gray of his eyes and was suppressed before it could be named. He said, at last, only that he had thought as much, and that he had come to Ashcombe not to accuse, but to consult. He said that he had, in the interval, caused certain inquiries to be made through his steward, and that the inquiries had returned to him this morning a piece of information which he would now, with Mrs. Ashcombe's leave, lay before them, since it seemed to him that the piece of information settled the matter, and settled it upon the shoulders of a person other than Miss Ashcombe. He unfolded the paper on the table. It was not the anonymous letter. It was, Iris saw at once, a sheet in another hand entirely. A bill of some kind, and there was, at the foot of it, a signature she did not know. And a date. The Duke laid his forefinger upon the date, and he said, mildly, that the letter he had received had described events said to have taken place at Ashcombe in October of the previous year, and had described them in a phrase which fixed them, unmistakably, upon a particular week in that month. The second, during which, the letter said, Miss Ashcombe had walked more than once with the officer in the lower orchard at dusk. He said the second week of October with the small, dry precision of a man reading the date on a headstone. Then he said, in the same tone, that the young lieutenant of dragoons whose name had been suggested to him by a second inquiry, and whom the writer of the letter had plainly had in mind, had, according to the regimental returns and to the bill which lay upon the table, been quartered at Winchester for the whole of that month, and had not, upon any day of that month, been within 30 miles of Ashcombe. He looked up. He said, quietly, there it is. He said quietly, and it will not do. Mrs. Ashcombe made a small sound at the back of her throat that Iris had not heard her make before. Iris did not, at that moment, permit herself any sound at all. She looked at the bill and at the date and at the Duke's forefinger upon the date, and she felt against the skin of her breastbone the small silver warmth of the thimble under the muslin, and she thought, in a voice that was almost her mother's, that a small thing on a headstone was worth more than a great many phrases in a drawing-room, and that a candle carried carefully across a windy yard was, on occasion, permitted to burn a little brighter. She did not smile. She inclined her head. She said, in the mildest voice she could summon, that she was very grateful to His Grace for the trouble he had taken. He looked at her. He said, without warmth, without coldness, only with the level attention with which he had first counted her at the Priory, that he had taken no trouble at all which he did not consider owed. It was not a question. It was a report of a weather he had at last decided to name. Then he rose. He bowed to Mrs. Ashcombe, he bowed, more briefly, to Iris. He said that he would call again at Mrs. Ashcombe's convenience, and that he would, in the meantime, cause the matter to be handled with such discretion as was possible, that the county's tongue could not, of course, be commanded, but that the county's eye could sometimes be redirected, and he would see to it that it was. He took his hat. He went. When the chaise had gone down the drive, Mrs. Ashcombe sat, without decoration, on the sofa, and she looked at Iris, and she said, in a voice that had not, that afternoon, the strength for its usual work, that she was sorry. She said it once. She did not say it well. Iris said only that her aunt had nothing to be sorry for. It was not true. They both knew it was not true. It was the sentence Iris chose because she had, in the years past, learned that a kindness offered where none had been earned was still, on the household ledger, an asset, and she was too old a bookkeeper to burn an asset in a fit of temper. The letter from Wentmore came the day after. It arrived in the afternoon by a private servant in the plain dark livery Lady Ashcombe had used since her husband's death 40 years before, and it was addressed to Iris in her great-aunt's own hand, which had, in the intervening years, grown small and slightly tremulous and had not lost any of its authority. Iris took it into the still room to open. It was not long. Lady Ashcombe wrote that she had received her great-niece's letter and had believed every word of it before she had finished the first paragraph. She wrote that she had, that morning, dispatched her own man of business to Winchester with instructions which she did not propose to trouble Iris with. She wrote that she had also, having thought upon the matter through the night, dispatched a note of her own to the Duke of Winford at Ravenholt, in which she had said certain things which she considered it his right to know, and which she was old enough and, she said, tart enough, to say to a man of his rank without being obliged to soften them. She wrote that Iris was to consider herself, from that day forward, invited to Wentmore at any hour she chose, without notice, and to bring with her, or leave behind, whichever of her relations she preferred. She wrote, at the end, one sentence which Iris read 3 times and folded away in the inside pocket of her dress, where she carried, for the rest of that afternoon, the small warm shape of it against her ribs. Lady Ashcombe wrote, "My dear, a slander is a small thing that can, if you allow it, grow teeth. Do not allow it." She had signed the letter with her name in full. Iris closed the letter and pressed it once between her palms, as one presses a warm cup at the end of a cold day, and she went out of the still room and along the passage to the drawing-room to tell her aunt that Lady Ashcombe had written, and she did not, upon the way, permit her hand to rest upon the ribbon at her throat, because a woman who touched a talisman every time it warmed would soon wear the ribbon through, but she permitted herself, for the length of one breath at the drawing-room door, to think the plain, simple sentence that no one in the house had yet allowed her to think. She had been believed, not asked to prove, not obliged to defend. Believed, she opened the door and went in. The following week passed in a weather that could not decide itself. The county tongue, redirected by a hand it did not see, discovered new interests, a scandal at Sarrow House concerning a footman and a bracelet, a horse of Mrs. Halbert's which had been unaccountably lamed and as unaccountably cured, a rumor that the vicar's wife had been offered a legacy by an unknown cousin in the north. The Ashcombe story, which had for a fortnight been the county's principal amusement, sank, as such stories sink when a hand redirects them, to the level of a small persistent murmur which one heard only if one listened for it, and which Iris did not intend to listen for. The Duke did not that week call at Ashcombe. He wrote, once, a short civil note to Mrs. Ashcombe, in which he said that he trusted the household was undisturbed, and that he hoped to have the honor of paying his respects at an hour to be arranged. It was, Iris saw, the letter of a man who had decided upon a course and was permitting the county to catch up with him. The county caught up. The invitations, which for a fortnight had been divided uneasily between Iris and Cordelia and their aunt, began to arrive in Iris's name alone, and Cordelia, watching the tray in the hall each morning, said less and less about the matter, and Mrs. Ashcombe, watching Cordelia, said less and less about anything. The house, which had for years arranged itself around the shape of a young woman who was its ornament, began, with the slow reluctance of an old house adjusting a load-bearing beam to arrange itself around the shape of a young woman who was its ornament in another sense. Iris did not, in that week, permit herself the luxury of triumph. Triumph, her mother had said, was a fire in a paper house. She read a little in the mornings, and she sewed a little in the afternoons, and she wrote once, briefly, to her great-aunt at Wentmore, and she did not, at any moment of the week, allow her mind to picture the Duke of Winford, or his gray eyes, or his low, dry voice, because she had learned early that a picture summoned too often burned the frame it hung in. It was on the Friday of that week that the note came, and the note was not from Ravenholt, but from Mrs. Halberd, and it invited Iris and her aunt and her sister to a small evening on the Saturday. In honor, Mrs. Halberd wrote with her usual breathlessness, of a small and select company which had been thinned by the weather, and which she was sure they would find agreeable. Iris read the note, and she folded it, and she went to her aunt with it in her hand, and her aunt read it, and her aunt did not, that morning, produce any decoration at all. She said only, quietly, that of course they would go, since to refuse was to concede, and she did not, that week, propose to concede. Iris inclined her head. She said she would see to Cordelia's white gown. Her aunt did not answer. Cordelia, who was practicing, as she had been practicing for 3 weeks, said nothing at all. They went, on the Saturday, in the plain-closed carriage that had for years done double service between Ashcombe and the parish church, and they arrived at Halberd Priory at 7, and the drive was crowded again with carriages, though fewer than before, and the hall smelt of lilies and beeswax, and faintly of rain, and beneath the rain, if one had a nose for such things, of the particular clean cold of a house that had been aired all day in preparation for a storm that had begun, in the west, to lift its head over the downs. The Duke of Winford was in the long saloon. The room had rearranged itself around him with the practiced choreography of a room that had, of late, made a habit of it. Lady Sarah, in a gown of deeper red than before, was not. That evening, in the circle at the sofa, she was standing at the far window with 2 of her own party, and her small, light laugh, when she produced it, did not travel. Mrs. Halberd came forward with her hands out, kissed Cordelia, pressed her aunt's hand, and took Iris by both hands and did not let go for a full moment, and said, in a voice that had, without her intending it, more warmth than she had ever addressed to Iris in her life, that she was so very glad she had come. It was affectionate. It was, at last, a question that had been asked and answered. Iris said she was very glad to be there. She meant it, that evening, in a different sense than she had ever meant it before. She stepped aside and let herself be conducted forward, as Cordelia had been conducted forward on the previous occasion, and she took her place near the tall window that gave onto the terrace, and she settled her hands into the pose that had served her since she was 17, one loose in the other, at rest. And she looked, once, without appearing to look, across the room. The Duke was standing near the pianoforte, in conversation with an elderly gentleman whose name Iris did not know, and he was giving the elderly gentleman the exact attention he had once given to the anecdote at Mrs. Halbert's. In the interval of the anecdote, his eyes lifted, unhurried, and traveled the room, and stopped, without appearing to have chosen to stop, on the gray figure at the window. His gaze was not long, it was not admiring. It was, so far as Iris could read it in that instant, only present, and it registered her. And it registered whatever it was that stood inside her, and it did not, this time, move on. It remained a moment. In the moment there passed between the two of them, across the width of a well-lit saloon, a silent exchange more precise than any spoken sentence, in which she understood that he had, for some days, been waiting for the hour in which they would be permitted, at last, a small private space, and that he had judged the hour to have come, and in which he understood that she had understood him, and that she would not, that evening, refuse the space, though she had not yet decided what she would do inside it. He inclined his head 1/4 of an inch. She inclined hers by the same measure. Outside the windows, in the west, the first low mutter of the coming storm made itself heard, and the candles in the saloon flickered once, considering, and settled, and the room went on with the small, careful business of not admitting that anything at all had occurred. The storm arrived, as such storms arrive, not all at once, but in a series of small, polite announcements which the room chose, for a while, to overlook. A gust took the terrace doors and rattled them once, and Mrs. Halberd, without pausing in her sentence, motioned to a footman, who crossed with the small extra care servants, use for a room whose evening is being observed by their mistress, and set the bar. A second gust took the chimney and reversed a curl of smoke into the saloon, and the elderly gentleman at the pianoforte, without pausing in his anecdote, moved his chair 1/4 of an inch. A third came against the west windows with the flat open palm of a hand and stayed there a moment, listening, and then withdrew. And the candles considered again, and the room considered with them, and the small, careful business of not admitting the storm continued its work. It was not, Iris understood, that Mrs. Halberd's guests were unaware of the weather. It was that the county, having decided the evening was to be the evening on which certain matters were settled, had resolved to sit through whatever weather the settling required. She stood at the tall window in the gray silk, with her hands loose in front of her, and she felt, against her breastbone, the small silver warmth of the thimble on its ribbon under the muslin, and she understood, without any heat, that she had entered the last hour of a season she had once believed would go on forever. Cordelia was at the pianoforte. Cordelia had, in the 10 days since the letter from Wentmore, said less each morning at breakfast and played more each afternoon in the drawing-room, and the phrase she had been perfecting for 3 weeks had at last been laid aside for a simpler air she had learned as a child, and she played it that evening in Mrs. Halberd's saloon, with a plainness that surprised the room, and did not, Iris thought, without any triumph, surprise her. Their aunt sat on a small chair near the fire, with her hands folded in the exact pose she had once required of Iris, and she did not, that evening, produce any decoration at all. Lady Sarah, at the far window, made her small light laugh once and did not repeat it, because a laugh which does not travel is not a weapon a woman of Lady Sarah's habits cares to spend twice in an evening, and she permitted herself, once, in the interval before supper, to cross the saloon on the pretext of admiring a fan, and to say to Iris, in the tone she reserved for her most delicate observations, that she was so glad, so very glad, to see the county's affections settling at last upon a young woman of such usefulness. She used the word plainly. She used it, Iris understood, as one uses the last coin in one's purse before an unfamiliar counter, without any confidence that the coin would spend. Iris inclined her head. She said, mildly, that Lady Sarah was very good to name the quality, since she had lately begun to think the word had been asked to carry more weight than the county intended by it, and that she was glad, in Lady Sarah's company, to hear it lightened at last. She said it without emphasis, without any suggestion that she had heard anything untoward, as though she were merely completing, out of politeness, a sentence Lady Sarah had begun. Lady Sarah's small light smile faded by a degree. She said, considering the fan, that Miss Iris was so very quick, and Iris, who had learned that a repetition without an audience was only a habit, did not answer, and Lady Sarah, after a moment in which she seemed to look about the saloon for the audience the phrase required, and found none, turned the fan over in her hand and moved on, and did not, in the whole rest of the evening, address Iris again. Supper was laid in the long dining room, and Mrs. Halbert's plan that evening had put Iris 3 places from the Duke on the same side, an arrangement so plainly modeled upon a previous plan that Mrs. Halbert, catching Iris's eye as she sat down, permitted herself the smallest confessing smile. Iris returned it. The Duke sat between Mrs. Halbert and the elderly gentleman of the anecdote, and he inclined his head to each in turn with the exact courtesy his mother had drilled into him before he could read, and he spoke, when spoken to, in the low, dry voice that fell only across the small space between him and his neighbor, and did not travel, and he did not, in the whole course of the supper, address a single sentence directly to Iris that could have been construed as an inquiry. But once, as a dish was set down, his eyes met hers across the small confusion of the passing plate, and he said, in a voice pitched to reach exactly her and no other person at the table, that he hoped the storm would not oblige her to leave early. He said it as one who reports a small fact. She said, in the same voice, that she thought the storm was likely to oblige her to stay. She said it without emphasis. She did not, at any point in the sentence, permit her face to answer it. He inclined his head 1/4 inch. The dish went on. Outside the west windows, the flat open palm of the wind came again and stayed longer, and Mrs. Halbert, glancing at the windows without pausing in her sentence, motioned to another footman, who went out and returned to whisper at her elbow, and Mrs. Halbert, without ceasing to smile at the elderly gentleman opposite, murmured back a short instruction and returned to her plate. The evening moved on. It moved on with the smooth, practiced efficiency of a hostess whose plans were being disarranged in a direction that suited her better than the plans themselves. When at last the ladies withdrew, the wind had moved from a palm to a shoulder, and the rain had begun in the manner rain begins when it has decided to stay, and Mrs. Halbert, kissing her aunt's mother upon the cheek, said, with the small, breathless warmth of a woman who had prepared the sentence some hours before, that of course no one was to think of the road at such an hour, and that the Priory had rooms enough for everyone who chose to stay, and that she would take it as a personal favor if the Ashcombe party would consent to be her guests until the morning. Mrs. Ashcombe, whose fingers had that evening begun again to tremble in the manner they had trembled over the Duke's first letter, accepted with a gratitude that was, for the first time in Iris's memory, not decorated. Cordelia, who had played the childhood air twice, and had not asked to play a third time, accepted with the plain courtesy of a young woman whose weapons had, for the evening, been quietly set aside. Iris inclined her head and thanked Mrs. Halbert, and Mrs. Halbert, taking her hand once again with both of her own, said, in a voice that was not intended to travel, that she had had the library made ready for anyone who could not sleep, since the library was warm, and she pressed Iris's hand once and did not let go for a moment, and released it. It was, Iris understood, a piece of choreography imposed by a hostess who had decided, at last, upon a side. She did not permit her face to answer it. She was shown to a small room at the end of the west passage, with a window that looked out upon the terrace and beyond to a wet lawn beaten silver by the rain, and she stood at the window a long time after the maid had gone, and she watched the storm come in across the downs. Ashcombe was 3 miles away and might as well have been across a sea. Her aunt, in the room at the head of the same passage, had gone to bed with the air of a woman who had reached at last the end of a battle she had not intended to fight. And Cordelia, in the room next to their aunt's, had gone to bed without speaking, and the house had gone to bed with them, in the sequence houses go to bed in when their hostess has quietly stopped in every passage to say a word to the servant at the end of it. The clock upon the mantel struck 12, and struck the quarter, and struck the half, and Iris did not undress. She stood in the gray silk at the window and watched the rain against the glass and thought, in a voice that was almost her mother's but had at last some measure of her own, that a candle carried across a windy yard was, on occasion, given a night in which to set itself down and let the wind blow through the yard and see what was left burning at the end of it. When at last she moved not toward the bed, but toward the door, and she took her single candle from the little table, and she went out into the passage without ceremony, because she had understood some hour before that Mrs. Halbert's remark about the library had not been made only for her aunt. The passage was dark. The candle lit her 3 feet at a time. She came to the top of the stair, and down, and along the ground-floor gallery, past the closed doors of the drawing-room and the dining-room, where the plate had been cleared away, and to the door of the library which stood, as Mrs. Halbert had promised, upon a hearth in which a fire had been made up an hour before and was still doing its work. He was there. He had been there, she saw at once, some little time. He was standing at the far window in his plain evening black, with his back to the room and his hands clasped behind him in the pose she had first seen at the Priory, and he did not turn when the door opened. He said, in the low, dry voice that had, that evening, entirely shed its authority persona and become simply the voice of a man alone in a room, that he had hoped she would come. He said it as one reports, at last, a truth held in reserve for some weeks. He said it not to the window, and not to her, but into the small space of the room between them. And then he turned, and he looked at her across the width of the library, and the fire moved once in the grate, and the storm came against the west windows with the flat open palm again, and stayed, and Iris, closing the door behind her with the small, exact courtesy that had served her since she was 17, set down her candle upon a low table and did not, for the length of a breath, permit herself any expression at all. He crossed the space between them not all at once, but in measured increments, a step and a pause in which he considered, and a step and a pause, as one crosses a floor whose boards one is not yet certain of, and he stopped at the length of the low table between them, which was, Iris noted without any heat, a distance she had not been asked to close, and he did not close it. He said, in the voice that had shed its rank, that he had rehearsed, on the ride down from Ravenholt that afternoon, a great many phrases which had seemed at Ravenholt to be exactly the phrases required, and which had, in the passage of the last quarter of an hour, revealed themselves as ornaments upon a plainer thing he had not the practice to say. He said that he had come to say the plainer thing, since ornament in a matter of this order was a form of cowardice, and he had, in his own life, endeavored to be many things, but not that. He said that he had watched her at the Priory and in her own drawing-room, and at Mrs. Halbert's second small evening, and at Sarrow House once, and in a passage on a wet afternoon in her own house, where the timing of a footman had permitted them one sentence he had thought about for weeks afterward, and that he had watched her, chiefly when other people believed themselves to be watching her, and had watched, too, in the intervals when the room believed her to be invisible. He said that he had learned to distrust a great many phrases in the course of his life, and that the phrases he had learned most to distrust were the phrases with which rooms diminished women. He said that he had come to say, in this room, in the sole hearing of the woman to whom the phrases had been most persistently applied, that they had been wrong. He did not say who had been wrong. The pronoun was, in its plain small emptiness, entirely sufficient. He looked at her across the low table. He did not smile. He did not extend his hand. He did not, in that instant, do any of the things a man of his rank might have been expected to do in a library at that hour and in that weather. He only, with the settled attention that had first counted her at the Priory, waited. Iris set her hands upon the back of the chair beside her. She felt against her breastbone the small silver warmth of the thimble on its ribbon under the muslin, and she thought, in a voice that was almost her mother's, that a candle carried carefully across a windy yard was not obliged, upon reaching the door at the other side of the yard, to enter the house at once. She said, in the mild, courteous voice that had served her since she was 17, that His Grace was very good to say what he had said, and that she thanked him for it, and that she would not, at that hour and in that room, pretend not to understand him. She said that she had, in the weeks past, understood a great deal that had not been said, and had, in her turn, said very little of what she had understood, and that she did not propose, that evening, to make up for the omission all at once. She said that she had spent 5 years in a house in which she had been asked, kindly and unkindly, to be useful, and that she had come in the last fortnight to a small, clean quiet, in which she had understood what the word had been asked to carry, and that she was not, that evening, prepared to exchange one word for another word without first knowing what the second word had been asked to carry. She said it plainly. She did not raise her voice. She did not, at any point in the sentence, permit her hands to leave the back of the chair. She said, finally, that she was not refusing him. She said that she was withholding, only, the immediate surrender of a woman who had lately learned that her own surrender was an asset in a ledger she had, at last, begun to keep for herself. She looked up at him across the low table. She said, gently, that she hoped His Grace would understand. He did understand. She saw it in his eyes at once. He inclined his head, not the small quarter-inch he used in drawing rooms, but a deeper, slower measure that had, in it, the admission of a debt. He said, in the voice that had shed its rank, that he understood, and that he had come, in fact, prepared to understand it, since he had known, from the first afternoon at Ashcombe, that whatever was between them would not be settled by a phrase, and that any phrase which sought to settle it was a phrase he did not wish to have upon his conscience. He said that he was therefore going to say a plainer thing still, and that he asked her only, in return, to hear it. He crossed the length of the low table then, in a single unhurried step, and stopped at the distance the low table had, until that moment kept between them, and he did not, in stopping, take her hand. He said quietly, I did not come, because you are the sister who was overlooked. I did not come because it would please my aunt or vex the county. I did not come because a picture arrived at Ravenholt of a young woman who was not you, and I found, upon returning it, that I had already thought too much about a young woman whose picture had not been sent. He paused. He said, more quietly still, I came because there was a moment at a tray in Mrs. Halbert's drawing room in which you completed, out of your sister's silence, a sentence your sister could not finish, and you did it without looking at the woman who had begun it. And I understood in that moment that I had spent a great many years in rooms in which no one had ever done such a thing for me, and I did not wish to spend any more of them. He paused again. He said, in the voice from which everything had, at last, been rubbed away except the working parts, I came because I wished to. He said, I came because I wished to. It was not a question. It was not a report of the weather. It was, Iris understood, the first sentence he had ever, in her hearing, said without any calculation of the room at all. She looked at him. His eyes were the gray of a sky that had at last decided upon its weather. The fire moved once in the grate. The storm at the west windows came again with the flat open palm and stayed. She said, in a voice so low it did not travel to the door, yes, she said it once. She said it as one sets down a candle on a table and steps away from it and permits it, at last, to burn without her hand. She said yes, because I wish it. Then, and only then, did she take her hands from the back of the chair and lift one of them and hold it out to him across the last small distance of the low table, palm up, empty, in the way one holds a hand out to a horse whose disposition one has, at last, had time to read. He took it. He did not let it go. He crossed the last of the distance without ceremony, and he stood at the length of a hand from her, and he lifted her hand once to his mouth, briefly, with the small correct courtesy of a man who had been drilled from before he could read to know what a hand was owed, and he did not, in setting it down again, release it. He kept it in the small warm cup of his own, and he did not, in the whole of the interval that followed, put it down. It was in that interval that Iris permitted herself, at last, one dignified, cathartic cry, framed not as collapse, but as the surfacing of a truth long held below the water, one shining, slow installment of relief that reached her cheek and stopped there, and did not travel further. She did not sob. She did not cover her face. She stood in the gray silk with her hand in his, and she permitted the truth to reach the surface for the length of a breath, and then she drew the breath, and she smiled, once, a small plain smile that had not appeared upon her face in 5 years. And she said, in the mild, courteous voice that had served her since she was 17, that she was quite well, and that he was not to be alarmed, he said, in the voice from which everything had been rubbed away, that he was not alarmed. He said it, she noted, with the smallest possible dry admission of what he was instead, and it was the first thing he had said, in her hearing, at which she permitted herself to laugh, a small dry laugh of her own that answered his, and the storm at the west windows heard the exchange and did not. For its own reasons, come again with the flat open palm, and the fire moved once in the grate, and the small silver thimble on its ribbon under the muslin lay warm at her breastbone, as if a hand had rested upon it, and had, at last, no need to withdraw. They stood a long time in the library. They spoke, in the interval, of small things and of larger things, and of a great many things which had, until that hour, been withheld on both sides for reasons neither of them any longer proposed to defend, and the clock on the mantel struck the hour and the quarter and the half, without either of them noticing that it had struck at all, and near 2 a.m. he set her hand down upon the arm of the chair beside her, and he lifted it once more to his mouth in the same small, correct courtesy. And he opened the library door for her, and he did not, in leading her back along the gallery to the foot of the stair, take her hand again. Because he understood, without her having to say it, that a woman who had spent 5 years learning to walk across a windy yard alone was not obliged, upon her first night of company, to unlearn the walk entirely. She went up the stair alone. She went into the small room at the end of the west passage alone. She undressed alone, and she took the ribbon from her neck, and she laid the small silver thimble upon the little table beside the candle, and she lay down in the great strange bed, and heard the storm move away eastward across the downs at last, and she slept, for the first time in a great many months, without practicing in her mind any sentence at all. The county learned in the morning what it had, in the manner of counties, already known in its bones the night before. Mrs. Halberd, at breakfast, was so warm to Iris that Iris was obliged, twice, to take her hand from her hostess's grasp in order to reach for the toast, and Mrs. Halberd, understanding this, laughed at herself with the small breathless warmth of a woman who had never been so glad to be scolded by a piece of bread. Their aunt, coming down late, in a gown she had not worn since the funeral of Iris's father, sat opposite Iris at the table and said, in a voice that had not, for the space of a fortnight, done its usual decoration, that she trusted Iris had slept, and Iris said she had slept very well, and their aunt looked at her a long moment across the marmalade and said, very quietly, that she was glad, and did not, that morning, add anything further. Cordelia came down last. She had, in the interval, put on her simplest gown, and she had dressed her hair without any of the small silvery arrangements she had spent 5 years perfecting, and she sat down at the table beside Iris, and she said, without looking at her, that she thought their mother would have been very pleased. She said it as one sets down. At last, a phrase one had been carrying uphill for a long distance. Iris turned her head and looked at her sister. She said, in the mild, courteous voice that had served her since she was 17, that she thought so too. It was the first plain thing they had said to each other in 5 years. Cordelia, after a moment, laughed, a small, unrehearsed laugh which had nothing silvery in it at all, and reached for the toast without asking, and Iris, without asking, passed it. Lady Sarah was not in the breakfast room. Lady Sarah had left, it was said, in the small hours, in a carriage summoned against the weather, and had returned to Sarrow House with an expression which the manservant who opened the door to her had, in later years, described with the terse economy of a man who did not wish to say more than had been said in his hearing, and in the weeks and months that followed she was to find, without ever quite understanding why, that the invitations which had for years arrived upon her tray by every post arrived instead a little more slowly and a little more sparingly, and that the small circles at her sofa on her own evenings were of a smaller and a less bright kind, and that the county's ear, which she had spent 20 years training to her voice, had grown, without her noticing the exact moment of the alteration, a little harder of hearing. The anonymous letter was never traced to any one hand. It did not need to be. The county's tongue, once redirected itself again, and it was known within the year that Lady Sarah had been observed to grow suddenly quiet in any room in which the Duke of Winford or the younger Miss Ashcombe was named, and this observation, repeated often enough in the county, became at last a piece of household weather. And Lady Sarah, who had spent 20 years arranging the county's weather to her own advantage, discovered, at 42, that a weather she had not arranged was a very difficult weather to sit through, and that a laugh, which did not travel, was, in the end, only a small dry sound made in an empty room. She did not, in the end, marry again. That, too, was a report of the weather. By high summer, the arrangements had been made. There was a settlement drawn up in London by Lady Ashcombe's own man of business, whose instructions from Wentmore had been very precise, and there was an announcement in the London papers, and there was a call at Ashcombe from the Duke's aunt, a small stout lady, in a plain black gown whose eyes, upon meeting Iris for the first time, had done a rapid small appraisal and had produced, at the end of it, a smile which had in it the recognition of a competence her nephew had, some months before, undertaken to explain to her by letter. There was a wedding. It was not a large wedding. It was held in the parish church at Ashcombe on a warm September morning, and Iris walked up the aisle in a gown of plain cream muslin which had been made over from one of her mother's, and she wore at her throat no ornament except the small silver thimble on its ribbon, worn, that morning, outside the muslin for the first time in 5 years, and there was, on the pew reserved for the family, an old woman in a plain black gown who had, that week, left her house in Somerset for the first time in 11 years, in order, she said tartly to anyone who inquired, to see with her own eyes a piece of business she had lately had a small hand in. The village lined the churchyard wall, and the vicar's wife wept in a manner she had not planned for, and Mrs. Halberd, in a bonnet of a colour she had not previously ventured, applauded once involuntarily as the party came out of the church, and then, without embarrassment, applauded again, and the county, in the manner of counties, applauded with her, since a county which has watched a family through a long winter is always pleased to be permitted a summer. They went to Ravenholt in the same afternoon. Ravenholt in September was long low and yellow-stoned in the late light, and the lake at the foot of the park lay still enough to hold the sky in exact copy, and the household, which had prepared itself for a mistress with the polite, anxious watchfulness of a household which had not had a mistress for a great many years, discovered within a fortnight that the mistress it had prepared itself for was a mistress who had, in her turn, prepared herself for it, and the polite, anxious watchfulness settled, without any speech being made about it, into the quiet, ordinary pleasure of a household running well. Iris did not, in the first month at Ravenholt, alter the arrangement of any room. She looked, and she noted, and she asked questions of the housekeeper, who was a woman of 60 with a face like a very good loaf of bread, and after a month she began to alter one room, and then another, and by the end of the season the household discovered that a good many pieces of furniture had, without anyone quite noticing, come to stand in the places in which they had always in fact belonged. That, too, was familiar. The village at Ravenholt, which had for a generation observed its duke at a distance, and had for a generation received his charity through the correct channels, and had for a generation not expected anything further, discovered over the course of the first winter that the young duchess had a way of appearing in cottages at the moment a kettle was about to boil dry, and of leaving them at the moment before a mother was about to say she needed nothing, and that she said, when she was thanked, only that she was glad to be of use, and that she said it as one uses a plain small word, which has at last been permitted to mean what it means. It was in the second year at Ravenholt that the school was built. It had been Iris's plan from the first month of her residence, drawn out in the small, tidy hand upon a sheet of plain paper in the still room at Ravenholt, which she had insisted upon establishing on the pattern of the still room at Ashcombe, and she had brought the sheet of paper to her husband upon a Sunday evening. And he had read it twice, and had said, in the low, dry voice that had, in the intervening year, produced a great many low, dry sentences she had come to know the exact weight of, that he thought it a very good plan, and that he did not intend to alter it, and that she was to consider herself, in the matter, the party principally consulted. It was built upon a piece of land at the edge of the village which had for years done nothing much but grow nettles, and it was built of the same yellow stone as Ravenholt, and it was built with 2 long low schoolrooms and a small house at one end for the schoolmistress, and it was opened upon a fine morning in April when the hawthorn was in flower, and the whole village came, and Mrs. Halbert came from Wiltshire, and Lady Ashcombe came from Wentmore in a plain travelling carriage, which had not been out of its coach-house for 2 years, and their Aunt Millicent came, and Cordelia came, in a plain gown of grey silk, that had, Iris noted, been chosen with a care Cordelia had, in the intervening year, quietly acquired, and the Duke's aunt came, and the vicar came. And the schoolmistress, a young woman of 26 whose credentials had been sent to Iris upon Lady Ashcombe's recommendation, and who had, upon being interviewed, quoted to Iris a sentence of her own mother's, which Iris had recognized as an aphorism of the exact kind her own mother had used, stood at the door of the small house at the end, and welcomed the children in. It was upon the steps of the schoolhouse, in the sunlight of that April morning, that the Duke of Winford, having been asked by the vicar to say a few words to the gathered village, and finding, upon rising, that the village had grown, without his intending it, to the number of some 300 souls, put both his hands upon the small stone parapet before him, and looked, once, across the hushed crowd, and said, in the voice that had, in the last year, entirely shed its authority persona and become simply the voice of a man among his neighbors, that he would not, upon this morning, speak long, since the morning was not his but the village's, and the village's, in truth, was not the village's either, but the work of one hand, and he would speak, briefly, of the hand. He said that when he had first come into the county in the previous spring he had heard, in a great many drawing rooms, a great many phrases used about the younger Miss Ashcombe of Ashcombe Hall. He said that he had heard her called useful, and he had heard her called overlooked, and he had heard her called, once in his hearing, quite quick, and he had heard, in each of these phrases, the same small, careful diminishment, and he had heard it delivered, most often, by voices which believed themselves to be kind. He said, in the low, dry voice which the village had come to know as the voice their duke used when he was saying a thing he had meant, that he had come, over the course of that spring, to know the woman these phrases had been asked to describe, and to know that the phrases had been wrong. He said the sentence plainly. He said, they were wrong. He said it again, more quietly, they were wrong. He said that he had come to know a woman who was patient without being passive, who was kind without being weak, and who was clever without being cruel. He named the three virtues without ornament, in the plain, steady triad the village would remember, and he said that he had come to know, further, that the true measure of a person was not the measure a room made of her upon a first glance, but the measure a room could not, if it were honest, avoid making of her upon 100th. He said that the schoolhouse behind him was 100th measure. He said that he hoped it would stand a great many years, and that he hoped, when the children who were that morning entering its door were themselves the age at which their parents now stood, they would remember that it had been built by a woman who had believed in them before anyone in the county had asked her whether she did, and that they would, in their own lives, believe in the children they in their turn would come to know, and that in this way, at least a small thing on a hillside in April would grow into a large thing which no one could afterward take away. He said the last sentence very quietly. He did not look, in saying it, at Iris. He looked at the crowd, and he waited a moment, and he said, "Thank you." And he stepped back. The applause that came was not the courteous applause of a village trained to applaud its duke. It was the applause of a village which had, for a year, been observing a duchess making small, quiet appearances in cottages at the moment a kettle was about to boil dry, and it went on for a length of time which the vicar, standing at the duke's elbow, had not planned for, and Lady Ashcombe, at the front of the crowd in her plain black gown, tapped her stick once upon the step in front of her in a small tart approving beat, and Mrs. Halberd wept without embarrassment, and Cordelia, in the gray silk, applauded with the plain flat clapping of a young woman who had learned, in the intervening year, how to applaud a thing she had not herself accomplished, and their Aunt Millicent, who had spent 30 years arranging her hands in poses, permitted her hands, for the length of the ovation, to be the hands of an ordinary woman clapping. They walked back, at the end of the morning, along the lane between the hawthorn hedges, in a light which had, at last, come out clear and warm after a night of rain, and the village was left to its schoolhouse, and the party from Ravenholt walked on ahead, and Iris and her husband, without any arrangement being made, fell a few paces behind. They did not, for some while, speak. The lane was wet, and the puddles held the sky, and somewhere across the fields a lark had begun its high, thin daylight sentence, and the small silver thimble on its ribbon at Iris's throat, worn, that morning, outside the muslin, lay warm to the touch of the sunlight, as if a hand had rested upon it, and had, at last, no need to withdraw. She said, at length, in the mild, courteous voice that had served her since she was 17, and had, in the intervening year, quietly acquired a small dry note of its own, that his speech had been very well made. He said, in the low, dry voice from which nothing had, that morning, been rubbed except the working parts, that it had been a very plain speech, and that he had not, upon rising, known whether he would make it. She said that she was glad he had. He said, after a moment, that he was glad too. He said, further, that he had spent the greater part of the ride down from Ravenholt that morning composing a much finer speech, and had abandoned the greater part of it upon looking, once, at the crowd, and had spoken, instead, the plainer thing. He said, with the smallest possible dry admission, that he had, in the year past, formed a small habit of speaking the plainer thing, and that he suspected the habit had been contracted from his wife. Iris laughed, a small dry laugh which answered his, and did not, for the length of a step, look at him. Then she turned her head, and she looked at him, and she said, in the plain voice she had, at last, allowed herself to keep for company, that she had, in the year past, understood at last what her mother had meant, some winters before, when she had said that a woman's dignity was a small candle you carried across a windy yard, and that no one else was obliged to shield the flame. She said that she had, for a great many years, understood the sentence only in its first half, and had believed it to mean that a woman was to walk alone, and to shield the flame alone, and to expect nothing from anyone. She said that she had, in the year past, understood at last that the second half of the sentence, that no one else was obliged, was not, in fact, a report of the world's indifference, but a small dry acknowledgement that when someone did, at last, come to stand between the flame and the wind, the standing was not an obligation, but a gift, and was to be received as one received a gift, without decoration, and without the small proud refusal which she had for a great many years practiced. She said, gently, that she was, at last, prepared to receive it. He did not at first answer. He walked on beside her a moment, and he lifted his hand, and he laid it lightly upon the small of her back, and he did not remove it, and he said, in a voice pitched to reach exactly her and no other person in the lane, that he was, at last, prepared to give it. He said, further, that he had spent a good many years believing himself to be, in the phrase of his old nurse, a man who required nothing of anyone, and that he had discovered, upon marrying, that he had required a great deal of one person in particular, and that he was, at last, prepared to admit it. He said, in the plain small voice from which everything had been rubbed away except the working parts, that she had been, from the first afternoon at Ashcombe, always worth believing in, and that he had not, in his own life, believed in a great many people, but that he had, in her case, believed at once and had never had occasion to revise the belief, and did not, that morning or upon any morning to come, propose to revise it. He said it as one sets down. At last, a thesis one had been carrying uphill for a long distance. Iris did not, for a length of time, speak. She lifted her hand, and she took his, from the small of her back, and she brought it round in front of them, and she held it in her own, and she did not, in the whole of the interval that followed, put it down. They walked, so joined, along the lane. It was not perfect. It was not easy. It was, simply, shared, and that was more than enough. Ahead of them, the party from Ravenholt turned the corner by the great yew, and the priory road opened out toward the yellow stone of the house upon the far ridge, and the last of the rain of the night before rose in a thin quiet mist from the fields on either side, and above them the sky, which had for so long been the gray of a sky that had not yet decided what weather it meant to be, opened, slowly, into the plain, clean blue of a morning after a storm, and their joined hands, moving forward together at the same unhurried pace, went on toward the threshold of the house upon the ridge, and toward whatever future waited, unhurried in its turn, upon the other side of the door.